My husband left me stranded at the airport with our feverish little boy because he thought I was worthless. What he didn't know was that the airline he mocked me for flying belonged to me. Before we dive into it, tell me in the comments where you're from. I love seeing the different places people tune in from. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. My name is Nora Hale, and almost nobody knows I own one of America's largest airlines. After my grandfather passed away, I inherited the company, but I chose to keep my identity private. Instead of sitting in a luxury office, I spent years quietly learning every part of the business, letting people judge me by what they assumed instead of who I really was. Even my husband, Grant Mercer, believed I was nothing more than an ordinary operations consultant. That morning, our 6-year-old son, Evan, was burning with a high fever as we rushed through the airport. I wanted to delay the trip and get him medical attention, but Grant cared only about an important business meeting. When our flight was briefly delayed, he lost his temper, blamed me for ruining his schedule, and shouted loud enough for nearby passengers to stare. Without a trace of concern for Evan, he grabbed his boarding pass, told me I would never succeed without him, and walked away. Seconds later, he disappeared through the boarding gate, leaving me alone with our sick child. As I held Evan close and watched the aircraft door close behind my husband, I realized something inside me had changed forever. I wasn't heartbroken anymore. I was done being underestimated. As I waited inside the airport with Evan resting against my shoulder, memories of my marriage replayed in my mind with painful clarity. Grant hadn't always been the man who walked away from his family. In the beginning, he was thoughtful, encouraging, and full of dreams. But everything changed as his career gained momentum. Every promotion seemed to make him believe he was more important than everyone around him. He constantly reminded me that he was the one paying the bills and building our future, never realizing I quietly owned a fortune worth more than $10 billion. I never corrected him because my late grandfather had taught me that people reveal their true character when they believe they have nothing to gain from you. I wanted a husband who loved me for who I was, not for what I owned. Over the years, Grant became increasingly controlling. He questioned my decisions, dismissed my opinions, and introduced me to colleagues as if my work barely mattered. Whenever someone asked about my career, he answered for me before I could speak, acting embarrassed that I was only an operations consultant. I kept convincing myself he was stressed and that things would improve, but they never did. Sitting in that airport while Evan's fever continued to rise, I finally stopped making excuses for him. Watching our son struggle while his father chose a meeting over his family forced me to face the truth I had avoided for years. This wasn't one terrible moment. It was the clearest example of a marriage built on disrespect, and I knew I could no longer pretend otherwise. An airport employee noticed Evan shivering in my arms and immediately realized his condition was more serious than an ordinary fever. Without creating a scene, she called for medical assistance and guided us through a secure hallway to a private executive lounge where Evan could rest in a quiet, comfortable space. Within minutes, the airport physician arrived to examine him while another staff member made a discreet phone call. I hadn't planned to reveal who I was that day, but protecting my son came before protecting my privacy. The lounge doors opened, and several senior airline executives hurried inside. The moment they saw me, their expressions changed from concern to respect. "Chairwoman Hale," one of them said, "we're deeply sorry for everything you've experienced today." They apologized for the delay, assured me that Evan would receive the best medical care available, and informed me that a company jet was already being prepared to take us wherever his doctors recommended. Every decision was made quickly and professionally, with Evan's health as the highest priority. Just outside the lounge, a few of Grant's coworkers happened to be waiting near another departure gate. They watched the executives surround me, confused by the level of attention I was receiving. They exchanged puzzled looks as they heard employees address me as Chairwoman Hale. Whispers spread through the terminal, and people began wondering how the woman Grant always described as an ordinary operations consultant could command so much authority. While questions traveled across the airport, Grant remained completely unaware. His flight was already in the air, his phone was switched off, and he had no idea that the truth about his wife was beginning to unfold without him. Grant stepped off the plane expecting to head straight to his meeting, still convinced he had made the right decision by leaving me behind. As passengers entered the terminal, two senior airline executives approached him with polite smiles. One of them glanced around before asking, "Excuse us, Mr. Mercer, did Chairwoman Nora Hale choose another arrival route? We were expecting to welcome both of you today." Grant stared at them in confusion before letting out a short laugh. He assumed someone had mixed me up with another passenger. "You must have the wrong person," he replied. "My wife is just an operations consultant. She doesn't own anything close to this airline." The executives exchanged uncertain looks. One of them opened a secure tablet displaying the company's leadership profile, while another presented official identification prepared for the chairwoman's visit. There was my photograph, my full name, and the title that left no room for doubt: Chairwoman and Owner, Nora Hale. The color drained from Grant's face as the reality settled in. His confident smile vanished, replaced by disbelief. He read the information again, hoping he had misunderstood, but every document confirmed the same truth. The woman he had mocked, ignored, and abandoned at the airport was the owner of the very airline he had flown that morning. In an instant, every cruel remark he had thrown at me came rushing back. He remembered blaming me for the delay, telling me I would never succeed without him, and walking away while our sick son needed both parents. For the first time in years, Grant understood the weight of his actions, and the confidence he had carried onto the flight disappeared completely. The moment Grant left the airport, he drove home convinced he could explain everything before the truth changed his life forever. During the entire trip, he rehearsed apology after apology, telling himself that once Nora understood he had acted out of stress, she would forgive him like she always had. But when he arrived at the house, he found it unusually quiet. A member of the household staff informed him that Nora had already packed her personal belongings, taken Evan, and moved into the family's private estate where they could recover in peace. She had also made it clear that she didn't want to be disturbed. Refusing to accept it, Grant drove to the estate and asked to see her. After a long wait, Nora agreed to meet him, but only in the sitting room while Evan rested upstairs. Grant immediately began apologizing, blaming pressure at work, missed opportunities, and months of overwhelming responsibilities. Nora listened without interrupting, her expression calm and unreadable. When he finally finished, she quietly reminded him of the countless moments he had dismissed her opinions, spoken over her in front of others, and treated her career as something insignificant. She reminded him how often he had chosen business over family dinners, important milestones, and even their son's needs. Grant tried to promise that everything would be different, but Nora gently stopped him. She explained that she had heard those promises before, and each one had ended the same way. Looking into her eyes, Grant noticed something that frightened him more than anger. The hope that had once kept their marriage together was gone. She wasn't trying to punish him anymore. She had simply stopped believing that his words would ever become actions. Over the next several days, Grant focused on saving his career, believing his professional success would remain untouched by the problems in his marriage. His consulting firm relied heavily on contracts with the airline, and he assumed those agreements would continue as they always had. What he didn't know was that an internal compliance review had already uncovered several ethical complaints involving project approvals, vendor recommendations, and conflicts of interest connected to his company. In the past, those reports had been waiting for routine evaluation, but now they were handled exactly according to company policy. Nora refused to interfere, even though she had the authority to influence the outcome. Instead, she instructed the airline's independent compliance officers to examine every agreement fairly and without favoritism. She made it clear that no one, including her own husband, would receive special treatment. If the contracts met company standards, they would continue. If they failed those standards, they would face the same consequences as anyone else's. The investigation moved quickly. Several major contracts were temporarily suspended while auditors reviewed financial records and business practices. Grant was called into meetings where executives questioned decisions he had never expected to defend. For the first time, his reputation alone wasn't enough to protect him. The connections he had depended on carried no weight once the review became independent and transparent. As clients began distancing themselves from the uncertainty surrounding his company, Grant realized his professional image had been built on confidence, but lasting respect required accountability. Sitting alone after another difficult meeting, he finally understood that success wasn't guaranteed by influence or promises. Every decision eventually faced scrutiny, and this time there was no one willing to shield him from the consequences of his own actions. A few days later, Grant's parents asked to meet Nora. They arrived at the private estate believing the situation could still be repaired. Grant's mother gently urged Nora not to throw away years of marriage over what she called a terrible mistake. His father agreed, insisting that every marriage faced difficult moments and that forgiveness was the only way a family could survive. They encouraged her to think about Evan and give Grant another chance before making any permanent decisions. Nora listened respectfully but didn't interrupt. Before she could respond, Evan slowly walked into the room, still recovering from his illness. He looked at his grandparents with innocent eyes and quietly asked, "If Dad loves me, why did he leave me when I was sick?" His soft voice filled the room with a silence that no one could escape. Grant's parents looked at each other, searching for an answer, but none came. For the first time, they couldn't defend their son's behavior or explain away what had happened at the airport. Just then, Calvin Rhodes, the attorney who had faithfully served Nora's late grandfather for decades, entered the room after finishing some legal paperwork. He had watched the family struggle without interfering, but now he spoke calmly. He reminded everyone that forgiveness is always a personal choice, but respect cannot be demanded after trust has been broken. Trust is earned through consistent actions, not emotional appeals. Grant's parents finally understood that this wasn't about one argument or one bad day. Years of neglect had led to this moment, and no amount of pressure could erase the pain their son had caused. A week later, Nora officially filed for divorce. She didn't act out of anger or a desire for revenge. By then, her emotions had settled, and her decision came from a place of clarity. She had spent years hoping Grant would become the husband and father he once promised to be, but the airport incident had shown her that waiting any longer would only hurt both her and Evan. Her priority was no longer saving the marriage. It was creating a stable, peaceful life for her son. When the legal process began, Nora requested primary custody of Evan, not because of her wealth or influence, but because she had always been the parent providing daily care, emotional support, and consistency. Her attorneys focused on Evan's health, education, and overall well-being, carefully documenting the routines and responsibilities Nora had managed throughout his life. Grant refused to believe the marriage was truly over. Confident that Nora would eventually give in, he hired an expensive legal team and expected a quick settlement. He assumed the case would revolve around money and property, areas where he believed he could negotiate. Instead, the proceedings centered on facts. Financial records showed Nora had quietly supported the family in ways Grant never realized. Messages, emails, calendars, and travel records revealed a long pattern of emotional distance, broken promises, and repeated moments when work came before family. The evidence didn't focus on a single argument at the airport. It told the story of years spent feeling overlooked and alone. As the case moved forward, Grant slowly realized that the greatest challenge wasn't dividing assets. It was facing a truthful record of the life he had chosen to create, one decision at a time. As the divorce moved into the discovery phase, both legal teams exchanged documents, emails, and financial records. Nora expected to learn more about Grant's business dealings, but she never imagined what his own correspondence would reveal. Among the files were private messages and planning notes showing that Grant had been preparing to end their marriage long before the airport incident. He had intended to wait until he secured a major promotion and several long-term contracts before filing for divorce. In his mind, the timing would give him the strongest advantage. Even more painful was reading his assumptions about her future. Grant repeatedly wrote that Nora had little money of her own because she worked an ordinary consulting job. He believed she would walk away with almost nothing and eventually depend on a modest settlement. He had built his entire strategy around the belief that she lacked the resources to challenge him. When Grant's attorney reviewed the same documents alongside the evidence of Nora's true financial position, he was visibly stunned. It became obvious that Grant had based months of legal planning on a completely false understanding of his own wife. His confidence had blinded him to the reality that Nora had never needed his income or his career to build a secure future. As Nora quietly read every page, the pain she felt wasn't caused by the planned divorce itself. It came from realizing how long Grant had been living with those intentions. The airport wasn't the moment their marriage collapsed. It was simply the first time he openly acted on beliefs he had carried for years. That understanding removed every remaining doubt from her mind. She knew she wasn't walking away from one terrible decision. She was leaving behind a life built on quiet disrespect and hidden plans. Several weeks later, Nora and Grant sat across from each other in a quiet mediation room, hoping to resolve the remaining issues without a lengthy court battle. The atmosphere was calm, but the weight of everything that had happened filled the room. For the first time since the divorce proceedings began, Grant spoke without excuses or anger. He admitted that he had taken Nora's loyalty for granted, allowed his career to become more important than his family, and failed both his wife and his son. His voice carried genuine regret as he apologized for abandoning them at the airport and for the years of neglect that had led to that moment. He insisted he would spend the rest of his life trying to become a better father and a better man. Nora listened quietly from beginning to end. She didn't interrupt or challenge his words. When he finished, she remained silent for a moment before asking one simple question. "Would you be here if I were still the woman you thought I was?" The room became completely still. Grant lowered his eyes and searched for an answer, but none came. He couldn't honestly say that discovering Nora owned the airline hadn't changed everything. His silence revealed more than any explanation ever could. The mediator observed the exchange carefully before speaking. He noted that this case wasn't defined by a single argument at an airport or one emotional decision. The evidence, the timeline, and even Grant's own admissions showed that the marriage had been falling apart for years. The airport had simply exposed a truth that had been hidden beneath everyday life. Nora quietly accepted those words, knowing they reflected exactly what she had finally come to understand. After the mediation concluded, the court approved a temporary parenting arrangement that allowed Grant supervised visits with Evan while he worked to rebuild their relationship. The decision wasn't meant to punish him but to give their son a safe and stable environment while emotions were still raw. Grant accepted the terms without arguing. For the first time, he understood that earning back trust would take far more than promises or apologies. During their first few visits, Evan remained polite but distant. He answered questions with short replies and rarely smiled. When Grant suggested they play games or read together, Evan participated quietly, but there was a hesitation that hadn't existed before. The memory of the airport still lingered in the little boy's mind. He couldn't forget the moment his father chose to board the plane while he was sick and frightened. That single decision had changed the way he looked at the person he had always admired. Grant tried to explain himself more than once, but he soon realized that explanations only reminded Evan of what had happened. Instead, he began focusing on being present. He arrived early for every visit, listened carefully when Evan spoke, and never rushed to leave. Slowly, he understood that children measure love through consistent actions rather than carefully chosen words. As the weeks passed, Grant noticed something that would have once seemed impossible. Business victories no longer brought him satisfaction. New contracts, promotions, and recognition felt empty because they couldn't repair the disappointment in his son's eyes. For the first time in his life, he realized that real success wasn't found in boardrooms or financial achievements. It was found in the trust of the family he had nearly lost, and rebuilding that trust would require patience every single day. As life gradually settled into a new routine, Nora turned her attention back to the airline with a renewed sense of purpose. The memory of holding Evan in her arms at the airport while desperately searching for help never left her. She realized that no parent facing a medical emergency should have to worry about delays, confusing procedures, or finding immediate assistance while caring for a frightened child. Instead of allowing that painful experience to remain a personal memory, she decided to use it to create meaningful change. Working closely with senior executives, medical professionals, and airport staff, Nora expanded the airline's children's medical travel program across every major hub in the company's network. Specially trained employees were assigned to respond quickly whenever a young passenger experienced a medical emergency. Families received priority assistance, immediate access to healthcare professionals when available, and faster transportation arrangements whenever urgent treatment required travel. The program also introduced private waiting areas designed to give sick children a calm environment while parents focused on their care instead of airport logistics. The initiative soon began helping families from every background. Parents who had never heard Nora's name quietly benefited from the improvements, grateful for the kindness they received during some of the hardest moments of their lives. Hearing their stories reminded Nora why leadership carried responsibilities beyond financial success. Many people expected her to use her wealth and influence to ruin Grant's future, but she chose a different path. She believed real strength wasn't measured by how completely someone could destroy another person. It was measured by the good they created after enduring hardship. By transforming her family's painful experience into a program that protected thousands of children, Nora found a purpose far greater than revenge. And that became her greatest victory. Several months passed before Nora and Grant saw each other again at the same airport where their lives had changed forever. Nora was there to inspect one of the airline's newest family assistance programs, while Grant had arrived early for a business trip after spending the morning with Evan. Neither of them expected the encounter. They noticed each other across the terminal and, after a brief pause, walked over with quiet composure. There was no anger left between them, only the understanding that time had changed them both. Grant was the first to speak. He sincerely thanked Nora for allowing him to remain an active part of Evan's life despite everything that had happened. He admitted that rebuilding his relationship with their son had been the hardest challenge he had ever faced, but also the most meaningful. He told Nora that the experience had forced him to confront the person he had become and that he would always regret the choices that nearly cost him his family. Nora accepted his words with a calm nod. She told him she was glad Evan was slowly rebuilding trust with his father because every child deserved the love of both parents whenever possible. Then she gently reminded Grant that forgiveness and reconciliation were not the same. She had let go of the bitterness because carrying it would only hold her back, but she could not rebuild a marriage after the trust they once shared had been broken so completely. Grant understood without arguing. They exchanged a final respectful goodbye before heading toward separate gates. As they walked in opposite directions through the terminal, both accepted that although they would always be connected through Evan, the future they once imagined together had come to a peaceful end. Standing beside the large airport windows, Nora watched one of her aircraft lift gracefully into the sky. Months earlier, this same airport had been the place where her husband walked away, leaving her alone with their sick son. Back then, she believed she had lost everything that mattered. Now, as she watched the plane disappear into the clouds, she realized that the hardest day of her life had also been the beginning of her greatest transformation. Owning a $10 billion airline had never been her greatest achievement. Money and success couldn't replace love, trust, or self-respect. Her real victory was discovering her own worth after spending years allowing someone else to define it. She no longer measured herself through Grant's opinions or anyone else's expectations. She had built a peaceful life where she and Evan felt safe, valued, and genuinely happy. Grant had also changed, but not without paying a painful price. He lost the family he had taken for granted and learned too late that ambition meant very little without the people who shared your life. Although he continued working to become a better father, he understood that some choices could never be undone. Trust, once broken, could only be rebuilt in part, never exactly as it had been before. As Evan slipped his small hand into hers, Nora smiled and looked toward the horizon. She knew the future would still bring challenges, but she no longer feared them. The pain of betrayal no longer controlled her decisions or defined her story. She finally understood that true revenge was never about making someone else suffer. It was about creating a life filled with dignity, purpose, peace, and love until the wounds of the past no longer had the power to shape your future.